Every day, I brought the same lunch to work. Rice, vegetables, a little chicken, all packed the night before into the same scratched plastic container I'd been using for years. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd photograph for anyone to see. It was just food, made at home, eaten quietly at my desk or at the corner of the break room table while everyone else around me unwrapped something from a restaurant 3 blocks away. My coworkers noticed, the way people always notice the things that are easiest to make fun of. They laughed. They called it poor people's food, said it with a little laugh at the end like it wasn't really an insult, just an observation, just a joke, just something to say while they waited for their own orders to be delivered. I never answered. I just smiled and kept eating. I'm Natalie. I'm 34, a financial analyst, and I've worked at the same company for 8 years now. Long enough to have watched people come and go. Long enough to know the particular rhythms of an office the way you know the creak of stairs in a house you've lived in for a while. I'm not loud. I've never been the person who commands a room or needs to be noticed to feel like I matter. I do my work carefully. I keep my head down, and for 8 years that quietness has apparently made me an easy target for people who mistake silence for weakness, who assume that if you don't defend yourself out loud, it must be because you have nothing to defend. There were 3 of them mostly. Amanda was the one who set the tone, the kind of person who could make an entire room laugh at someone else's expense without ever quite crossing the line into something you could formally complain about. Brian was always the one turning things into jokes, quick with a comment, quicker to laugh at his own comments before anyone else had a chance to. And Olivia hovered somewhere in the background, always careful to look uninvolved, the one who never said the cruel thing directly but somehow made sure everyone in the building knew about it by the end of the day. Together they had a way of making the break room feel like a stage I hadn't auditioned for, and every day, my lunch became one of the props. It became a kind of ritual, the way these things do in offices where nobody ever really stops to ask whether a joke has worn out its welcome. Every day at lunch, I would watch them compare notes on the newest restaurant that had opened downtown, the tasting menu Amanda had tried over the weekend, the steakhouse Brian was taking his girlfriend to for her birthday, the elaborate salads Olivia photographed for everyone to see before she ate a single bite. And every day, I would open my container of rice and vegetables and chicken, and someone would say something about it, some small comment wrapped in a laugh, and the others would laugh along, and I would say nothing at all. I remember one afternoon in particular, not because it was worse than the others, but because it was the moment I understood exactly how little any of them actually saw me. Amanda looked over at my lunch, wrinkled her nose in that theatrical way she had, and said, loud enough for half the break room to hear, "Maybe one day we'll buy you a real lunch." Everyone laughed. Brian added something about coupons. Olivia smiled without quite meeting my eyes, the way she always did when she wanted credit for finding something funny without actually having to say anything herself. I sat there, container in my lap, chopsticks in my hand, and I smiled too, and I kept eating, because what none of them knew, what none of them had ever once thought to ask, was that I wasn't eating rice and vegetables because it was all I could afford in the way they assumed. I was eating it because I had decided quietly, months earlier, that there were things I cared about more than being seen as someone who could afford better. I've always believed that the things you do without needing anyone to see them are the things that actually mean something. I never set out to prove that to anyone at that office. I certainly never expected to have to. I had grown up watching my own parents work quietly and give quietly, never expecting recognition, never treating generosity as something that needed an announcement, and somewhere along the way that had simply become part of how I moved through the world too. But there is a particular kind of loneliness in being laughed at for a life you've chosen deliberately, in letting people believe the smaller, meaner version of your story because the truth isn't something you're willing to hand out for free, especially not to people who have already decided, without asking, exactly who you are. The year had been hard for the company, harder than most of us fully understood from where we sat. There had been warning signs for months, budget meetings that ran longer than usual, department heads called into closed-door conversations, a general tension that moved through the office like weather. And then, one morning, it arrived all at once. The company announced layoffs. Not a small trim, but something significant, the kind of cut that meant entire teams could disappear, that meant people who had worked there for years suddenly had no idea if they would still have a desk to sit at by the end of the month. The office turned into something almost unrecognizable in the days that followed. People who had spent years being friendly with each other suddenly eyed one another with suspicion, wondering who would be next, wondering whose name would appear on which list. Rumors moved faster than facts. People started looking for someone to blame, the way people always do when they're afraid and have no real target for that fear, and for a little while, whispers started circling that maybe the finance department had mismanaged something. That maybe someone specific had made a mistake that had cost the company more than it should have. And then, in the middle of all that noise, the CEO asked to see me in his office. I remember walking down that hallway and feeling every eye in the building on my back. I remember hearing, without even needing to turn around, the murmur that followed me, the certainty in people's voices as they said, almost gleefully, that I must be first, that quiet and remarkable Natalie from finance was clearly the one who had done something wrong. Why else would the CEO want to see her personally in the middle of a round of layoffs? Amanda didn't even try to hide her smirk. I heard her say something to Brian as I passed, something about how she always wondered about me, and Brian laughed, and Olivia just watched, the way she always did, careful and uninvolved and somehow still part of it. I sat down across from the CEO's desk, and for a moment, I'll admit, even I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. It had been a hard year. Mistakes happen, and I had spent enough time reviewing numbers over the past several months to know that our margins had been thinner than usual, that difficult decisions were being made at every level. But that isn't what he wanted to talk to me about at all. He told me the company had called an all-hands meeting for later that afternoon, and he asked if I would be comfortable standing beside him while he spoke. He didn't explain much more than that in the moment, just thanked me, quietly and sincerely, in a way that made me realize he already knew something the rest of the building didn't. The meeting that afternoon was unlike any I had sat through in 8 years at that company. Everyone gathered in the largest conference room, spilling out into the hallway, the atmosphere thick with the particular anxiety of people who have spent days bracing for bad news. The CEO stood at the front and told everyone plainly that it had been a difficult financial year, that the company had come close to cutting far more positions than it ultimately had. And then he said that there was someone in the room, someone many of them worked beside every single day, who was responsible for the fact that dozens of people still had jobs to come back to on Monday. He said that months earlier quietly, without asking for any recognition, without telling a single person, one employee had voluntarily given up her entire annual bonus, a significant sum, and had specifically requested that the money be redirected toward covering the positions that were most at risk of elimination. She hadn't wanted her name attached to it. She hadn't wanted a thank you, a plaque, an announcement. She had simply asked that it be done, quietly, and had gone back to her desk afterward as if nothing had happened at all. He said my name. I felt the room shift before I even fully processed what was happening, a kind of collective intake of breath, the sound of dozens of people rearranging, in real time, everything they thought they understood about someone they had worked beside for years and never actually seen. I didn't look for Amanda's face in that moment, though I heard later, from someone else, exactly what it looked like. I didn't need to see it. I already knew. What none of them had ever bothered to ask, in all those months of jokes about my lunch, was why a financial analyst who had worked steadily at the same company for 8 years would choose to eat rice and vegetables out of the same plastic container every single day instead of joining them at whatever new restaurant had opened downtown. They had built an entire story around me without a single fact to support it, a story that made them feel a little better about their own choices, a little superior in some small, unimportant way. The truth was simpler and, I think, harder for people to sit with than the joke had ever been. I wasn't saving that money because I had no choice. I was saving it because I had decided quietly that there were people around me who needed it more than I needed to prove anything to anyone about what I could afford. After the meeting ended, people didn't quite know what to do with themselves. There was a strange, shuffling quiet in the hallways, the sound of an entire office recalibrating. And then Amanda found me. She looked different than I had ever seen her look, uncertain in a way that didn't suit the version of her I had come to expect over the years. She started to say something, an apology, I think, though it came out clumsy and half-formed, the kind of apology people give when they're more uncomfortable with being caught than genuinely sorry for what they did. I let her finish. I didn't feel the need to make it harder than it already was for her, and I didn't feel the need to make it easier either. I told her simply that kindness doesn't need an audience. I meant it the way it sounded, not as a way of scoring a point, not as a clever line meant to make her feel smaller than she already did, but as the truest thing I could say about why I had done what I did in the first place. I hadn't given up that bonus because I wanted anyone to eventually find out and feel ashamed of themselves. I had given it up because it was the right thing to do at a moment when I had the ability to do it, and because some things matter more when no one's watching than when everyone is. Then I did the only thing that felt right, which was nothing dramatic at all. I picked up my container, the same scratched plastic container I had carried into that break room for months, and I walked over to my usual seat at the usual table, and I sat down, and I ate the same simple lunch I always ate. Rice. Vegetables. A little chicken. Nothing had changed about the food itself. What had changed was the room around it. Nobody laughed that day. Nobody made a joke about buying me a real lunch, or wrinkled their nose at the sight of my container, or exchanged a knowing look across the table the way they used to. They just watched me eat quietly, the same way I had always eaten, and I think, for the first time since I had started working there, the silence in that room actually belonged to me instead of being something I had to sit inside of. I think about that afternoon often now, not because I need the memory of being vindicated, but because of what it taught me about the assumptions people carry without ever noticing they're carrying them. It's so easy to look at someone's simple life, their modest lunch, their unremarkable habits, and build an entire narrative around what that must mean about them, their circumstances, their worth, their intelligence, even their ambition. People had decided, based on nothing more than a plastic container and a quiet demeanor, exactly who I was and exactly how much I had to offer, and they had never once felt the need to check whether any of it was true. It's much harder, and much rarer, to simply ask, or to withhold judgment long enough to actually find out. I never set out to teach anyone that lesson. I only ever wanted to help the people I could help, in the quietest way I knew how, and if I'm honest, part of me still believes that lesson would have meant more to them if they had learned it on their own, without the CEO's help at all. Never judge someone's simple life. You may be standing beside the most generous person in the room, and you may never know it unless the truth finds its own way of surfacing on its own. I kept my secret for months, not because I was ashamed of it, but because I never believed generosity needed to be witnessed to be real. Even now, knowing how it all came out, I sometimes wonder whether I would have told anyone at all if the CEO hadn't chosen to say it for me that afternoon. Would you have told everyone the truth, or kept it a secret the way I did, content to let people believe whatever story was easiest for them, as long as you knew, quietly, what the real one actually was?